All right, welcome to week 3. I hope week 2 went well and that you were able to complete everything. Now, for this week, we're thinking about the intersection of religion and science. We're thinking about how that um, perception of the interaction between religion and science, or necessarily the separation of religion and science, plays into popular culture. To do this, we're going to look at Bill Maher's Religulous. For some of you, it may be a hard film to watch, but remember that we're sort of thinking about, what does he represent? What portion of the population does his ideas represent? Um, how does this get to be a part of sort of common perception of religion and science, and what does it matter for us? The film is rather entertaining. But do sort of keep in mind that, you know, one of the things that we're doing in this section is to think about how religion and science are not necessarily against each other, and that to see science as necessarily the champion of all things rational is extremely problematic. And so that brings us to sort of this week's questions for your reflection paper. The first being, and you have to answer all three, what kind of approach is Bill Maher taking when it comes to religion and science? Right, so you're going to see him oftentimes reference science as necessarily being factually based, and religion being referred to as um, having only to do with faith. Um, the next question is, how have religion and science developed alongside one another? For this, you're going to kind of get um, some from the WoofNow article, but also from Ivan Stransky's article. Um, and then finally, how is the view that science is rational and progressive versus irrational religion problematic when we look at Weber's theory? Right, and so what I'm trying to get you to work through here is that one of the things that developed in the 18th century and 19th century in Europe was this idea that the secularism, or the secular sphere of life, had to do with science and that which is provable. And so religion became the other of science. And so as we sort of developed our views on religion and science, it was difficult to think about science without religion. It was difficult to think about religion without science because they were seen as opposites. And yet this comes from a very Christian worldview. This comes from a very particular way of understanding the world. Um, and yet we have someone like Wolf now saying, well, there's no contradictions here, right? These are all reasonable possibilities, and they don't have to be necessarily interested in the same things. For example, the question of um, how many protons, electrons, and neutrons does an atom have is not necessarily a question that uh, religion has an answer for. Um, I mean, some people may disagree, but in general, what Withnow is trying to say is that they're dealing with two different kind of questions and have two different kinds of answers, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily have to be seen as one opposed to the other. I mean, Mar will go to the Creation Museum in order to show you that these people think they're crazy um, because they have humans and dinosaurs in the same sort of time frame. And yet, what you find is the Catholic Church, which is also mentioned in the film, actually sees evolution as a part of of as an accepted sort of um, not even theory, but it's accepted that that's the way that the world developed. And so it's not really fair to say that religion and science are necessarily never going to never going to agree. Rather, there are lots of people who um, have both. There's a there's a part in the film, and Withnaus talks about this as well, that most high level scientists aren't religious. There's some really interesting work being done at ASU actually by Gaiman Bennett, who looks at perhaps the question of whether a scientist working in a genetics lab is going to church is an interesting question, But there's also an additional sort of interesting thing going on in a genetics lab. There's a lot more gray areas, and there's a lot more, will you say, faith in the process that's being done, that resembles things like religious faith. That sort of help us think about science as less factually based. So I'm not saying that science is not factually based. I'm saying that the processes that we're taught are very rational and very strict. In fact, have a lot more ambiguity in them, and this is very high level science. Um, so, for example, one of the top genetic labs in the country, there's an individual who does sort of deals with genetic mutations, but also does gene editing. All of his materials have been copied, so his notes. He's been filmed. There are lots of ways that people have tried to replicate exactly his experiments, but no one can do it. And so, why is that, right? Because there's a human component to this, right? And there's some other, doesn't mean that there has to be something supernatural or something going on here, but there is an element of uh, people going on here where there's an interaction that can't necessarily be accounted for. There's lots more that we can go into, and I'd be happy to email. The second reading that we're going into this week is Weber. Weber is very interesting because he helps us think about, he sort of turns us in the study of religion from seeing religion as necessarily something that happened, uh, several hundred years ago, that it's a result of something else, as something that can explain happenings in the world. And so, for example, he looks at capitalism and the rise of capitalism and the way in which, particularly Calvinism, facilitated the rise of capitalism. And so, how would this happen? And so, you'll see in the article, it'll sort of lay that out for you. But what I want you to think about is, how does the ascetic, not aesthetic, but aesthetic viewpoint, that is not spending all of your money. Great capitalists didn't automatically spend all their money there. They amassed large quantities of wealth so that they could reinvest and so that they could appear to be wealthy. It wasn't as if they got money and then immediately spent it. That's not the sort of modern day capitalist that Weber's talking about. This also developed with Calvinism because they had the idea of predestination, and predestination meaning when you're born, you're either going to heaven or hell, and you can't really do anything about it. However, those who, and you'll see how the calling sort of works in here, in the reading, but those who are destined for salvation will completely engage with the world, and by completely engaging the world, when they receive wealth, they don't necessarily spend it right away because it's not their wealth; it's an indication of their salvation, right? So, of course, you want to engage with the world because the only way to know whether you're saved or not is to get wealth or not get wealth. Um, this has really interesting ties to the prosperity gospel, in sort of modern day America, where um, how do I know I'm saved? How do I know I'm saved? It's because I donated to the church and therefore received threefold back. Um, how is this related to religion and science? Well, um, religion is in Weber's idea is no longer sort of separate from science and is no longer can be pushed to the side, but rather necessarily explains things. And so the reason that science is rational, the reason that it's so problematic to see religion as irrational and science as rational is because religion can explain things also, in Weber's theory, and that in Withno's idea they are not necessarily contradictions, but rather both have possible ways for explaining things. And so I hope that you enjoy the films this week, that you learn a lot, that you're thinking very critically about the relationship between religion and science, and I look forward to seeing you next week.